The sun rose over the military base as Colonel Sarah Martinez walked toward the main gate wearing regular clothes. She picked casual clothing on purpose for her first day at Fort Henderson, a white shirt, jeans, and comfortable shoes. Her dark hair was tied back simply, and she only carried a small bag with her ID and official papers. The two young guards at the entrance barely noticed her as she got closer. Private Johnson, just 22 years old, was writing with his partner about weekend plans. Sergeant Williams, a bit older but acting like he owned the place after 3 years at this gate, nodded along while lazily watching the road. Sarah had traveled from Washington, D.C., where she'd spent 6 months learning about her new job. This base had serious problems, bad leadership, unhappy soldiers, and a terrible reputation. The last commander had been fired after several incidents that made national news. Getting closer to the gate, Sarah spotted troubling signs everywhere. The guard station had dirty windows, cigarette butts littered the ground despite no smoking signs, and the American flag looked wrinkled from careless handling. At her last posting, this would never happen, but here it seemed normal. The Defense Department chose Sarah for this tough assignment because she fixed struggling units. At 38, she'd already run 2 other bases and built a reputation for being strict but caring, creative in her leadership style, and totally committed to doing things right. Her troops respected her rank, yes, but also because she worked beside them and truly cared about their lives. Still, Sarah knew some people questioned her appointment. Old-school military leaders wondered if someone like her could handle such a difficult assignment. She'd heard whispers in Pentagon hallways, quiet suggestions that Fort Henderson needed a more traditional leader. Sarah heard every comment, and they only made her more determined to prove herself. Walking up to the gate, Sarah heard the guards still talking casually. Private Johnson complained about cafeteria meals, while Sergeant Williams recommended local restaurants that delivered. Neither seemed focused on their actual duties, and Sarah mentally noted the need for better gate security. The military base beyond the checkpoint looked like a small town. Fort Henderson held over 5,000 people and their families, with housing, schools, hospitals, and training areas. It was huge, and Sarah felt the responsibility as she looked through the gate at her new command. She'd spent serious time studying personnel records and base reports before arriving. The numbers told a worrying story. Soldiers were quitting more often, rule breaking was increasing, and training results had dropped for 18 months straight. Worse were reports of poor morale and a feeling among troops that Fort Henderson was where military careers died. Sarah always led from the front. She believed in setting an example, staying visible, and keeping high standards while genuinely caring about her people. She learned early that respect must be earned through skill, fairness, and real concern for soldier welfare. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to command a base where discipline had collapsed, and these gate guards perfectly demonstrated the problems she'd been sent to solve. It felt like the universe was giving her a perfect example of what needed changing. Reaching the checkpoint, Sarah took a breath and prepared for what she knew would be the first of many challenges. She understood that handling this moment would set the tone for everything ahead. The guards still hadn't noticed her too absorbed in weekend talk and military life complaints. Sarah learned long ago that every interaction, no matter how tiny, was a chance to lead and make an impression. She also knew her success would depend not just on big policy changes, but on countless small moments like this, where standards were either maintained or allowed to crumble. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely at the checkpoint window. Her voice stayed calm and professional, carrying just enough authority without aggression. Private Johnson looked up from his coffee with an annoyed face, like she'd interrupted something important. Sergeant Williams barely glanced her way before returning to his papers. The casual disrespect for proper military behavior was obvious to Sarah, who expected crisp salutes and immediate attention at any military checkpoint. "Can I help you?" Private Johnson asked, sounding like helping visitors was a burden rather than a job. He didn't stand, didn't salute, and made zero effort to act professional. His uniform was wrinkled, his hair too long, and a coffee stain marked his shirt. Sarah pulled out her military ID and transfer papers. She placed them on the counter and waited patiently while Private Johnson reluctantly picked them up. She watched his face closely, curious how long he'd need to understand what he was seeing. "Ma'am, this says you're a colonel," Private Johnson said after a moment, sounding confused rather than respectful. "But you're not wearing a uniform. I need to check this with my boss." Sergeant Williams finally looked up from his work. Hearing the word colonel, he glanced at Sarah skeptically, taking in her civilian clothes and casual look. "Let me see those," he said, reaching for the ID and papers. His tone suggested he thought this was a mistake or fraud. Sarah stayed calm and patient as Sergeant Williams examined her credentials more carefully than his partner had. She could see him struggling to match her appearance with her rank and order. The transfer papers clearly stated that Colonel Sarah Martinez would take command of Fort Henderson immediately, but Williams seemed unable to accept what he was reading. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I can't let you on base without checking this properly," Sergeant Williams said finally. "These papers look real, but you're not in uniform and nobody told us about a new commander arriving today. I need to call the base commander's office." Sarah nodded with understanding. "That's fine, Sergeant. I appreciate you following security rules even if you could show better military manners." Her comment was gentle but pointed, and both guards straightened up slightly, realizing someone who understood military standards was judging them. While Sergeant Williams made his call, Sarah observed the checkpoint more closely. The security booth was messy with personal items, empty food containers, and magazines unrelated to military work. The visitor logbook appeared days behind, and the communication equipment looked poorly maintained for months. She heard Williams talking to someone on the phone, sounding increasingly confused. "Yes, sir. I have a woman here claiming to be Colonel Martinez." "No, sir. She's not in uniform." "Yes, sir." The orders look real, but there was a long pause as he listened. Private Johnson now studied Sarah more carefully. Starting to realize he should take this seriously, he tried to straighten his uniform and stand better. But the damage was done. Sarah saw recognition dawning that he might have made a huge mistake. The call continued for several minutes, with Williams becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Sarah couldn't hear the other person, but Williams's responses showed he was getting information that made him nervous. His voice became more respectful, with more frequent sirs. Sarah used this time to think about what this revealed about Fort Henderson. The lack of communication about her arrival, poor checkpoint maintenance, unprofessional guard behavior, and general laziness all pointed to deep problems beyond individual failures. This was exactly what she'd been brought here to fix. Finally, Sergeant Williams ended his call and turned back to Sarah with a completely changed attitude. His face had gone pale and his hands shook slightly as he returned her ID and papers. "Ma'am, there seems to have been a mix-up. The base commander's office confirms who you are and your orders." Sarah took her documents back with the same calm expression. "Thank you for checking my credentials, Sergeant. Now, may I go on to the base?" But as Williams prepared to raise the gate, his partner created another problem that would make this even more complicated. Private Johnson stepped forward, apparently not hearing or understanding the phone conversation. "Wait a minute, Sarge," he said, holding up his hand to stop Williams. "I don't care what anyone says on the phone. This lady isn't in uniform, and she doesn't look like any colonel I've ever seen." Sarah watched with interest as things got worse. Here was a perfect example of poor communication, lack of respect for authority, and the kind of rule-breaking that only exists where standards have completely failed. Private Johnson was basically overruling his own sergeant, based on nothing but his personal opinion about what a colonel should look like. "Johnson, get back to your spot," Sergeant Williams hissed. Clearly embarrassed and increasingly aware they were dealing with someone who seriously outranked them both. The base commander's office confirmed who she is, but Private Johnson wouldn't back down. "Ma'am, you can't enter this base," he said directly to Sarah, his voice full of misplaced confidence. "I don't care what some phone call says. Military people must wear proper uniforms to enter, and civilians need special visitor passes arranged ahead of time." Sarah could see Private Johnson was committed to his position and wouldn't change his mind easily. This gave her an interesting leadership challenge. She could easily fix this by demanding to speak to their boss or insisting they follow the direct orders just received from the base commander's office. However, she saw this as a teaching moment that could help her in the coming days. "Private Johnson," Sarah said, her voice staying calm but becoming slightly more formal, "I appreciate your dedication to security rules. However, I think there are some parts of military procedure you haven't fully considered." She pulled out her phone and dialed a number from memory. After a moment, someone answered, and Sarah spoke clearly enough for both guards to hear. "This is Colonel Martinez. I'm at Fort Henderson's front gate, and I need someone sent here to escort me to headquarters." "Yes, I understand there was a communication failure. No, I don't think punishment is necessary right now, but we need to review gate security procedures." Both guards now stared at Sarah with growing realization they'd made a serious mistake. The confidence drained from Private Johnson's face as he understood what his actions meant. Sergeant Williams looked like he wanted to vanish entirely. "Gentlemen," Sarah said after ending her call, "in about 5 minutes a vehicle will arrive to escort me onto this base. When that happens, you'll see several senior officers who won't be happy about this. I want you to understand that how you handle the next few minutes will determine whether this becomes a learning experience or a career-ending mistake." Private Johnson's bravado completely disappeared. "We were just following security rules." "We didn't know what you didn't know," Sarah interrupted gently. is that proper military behavior and respect for authority are more important than blindly following rules you don't fully understand. When your sergeant received confirmation from the base commander's office, that should have ended the discussion. Sergeant Williams now stood at attention, finally showing proper military courtesy that should have been there from the start. Ma'am, we apologize for any trouble. We should have handled this better. Sarah nodded. Sergeant Williams, I can see you understand the problem. Private Johnson, what do you think you should have done differently? The young private struggled to find words, clearly overwhelmed. Ma'am, I should have trusted my sergeant's decision, and I should have shown proper respect for your. That's a start, Sarah said, but the bigger problem is you made assumptions based on looks rather than facts. In the military, we judge people by their actions, their skills, and their character, not by whether they look like we expect. As they waited for her escort, Sarah used the time to observe more about base operations. She saw vehicles coming and going without proper security checks, people walking around in substandard uniforms, and a general casualness that would be unthinkable at a well-run military base. A black car approached the gate, and Sarah could see through the windshield that it held several officers in dress uniforms. This was about to become a very educational experience for Private Johnson and Sergeant Williams, and Sarah hoped they'd learn from it rather than just be punished. The vehicle stopped at the checkpoint, and a major stepped out. Behind him, Sarah saw a full colonel and what appeared to be the base sergeant major. Help had arrived, and they didn't look pleased with what they saw at their front gate. Major Harrison stepped out first, his face red with embarrassment and anger. Behind him came Colonel Richards, the current acting base commander, and Sergeant Major Thompson, whose expression suggested serious consequences were coming. The contrast between their crisp professional appearance and the sloppy condition of the checkpoint guards couldn't have been stronger. Colonel Martinez, Major Harrison said, snapping to attention and delivering a perfect salute. On behalf of Fort Henderson, I apologize for this completely unacceptable situation. We had no idea our gate security was operating with such lack of professionalism. Sarah returned the salute crisply. Major Harrison, thank you for coming personally. I think this has been educational for everyone involved. She gestured toward the two guards now standing rigidly at attention, clearly terrified about what was coming. Colonel Richards approached the checkpoint window, his eyes taking in every detail of the unprofessional scene. The empty coffee cups, personal magazines, messy guard appearance, and general disorder all painted a picture of a unit that had lost its way. His voice was cold and controlled when he spoke. Sergeant Williams, Private Johnson, explain to me how you managed to prevent your incoming commanding officer from entering her own base. The question hung in the air like a threat, and both guards seemed to shrink under his stare. Sergeant Williams tried to explain, his voice shaking with nervousness. Sir, we followed security rules and checked her ID, but Private Johnson felt that since she wasn't in uniform. Stop right there, Sergeant Major Thompson interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd handled military discipline for over 20 years. Are you telling me a private overruled verification from the base commander's office because he didn't like how someone was dressed? The situation was quickly heading toward a disciplinary disaster, and Sarah realized she needed to step in before these two young soldiers destroyed their careers over what was basically a system failure rather than personal meanness. Gentlemen, Sarah said, her voice calm but commanding enough to get everyone's attention. I'd like to speak with you privately before any decisions are made about these soldiers. Colonel Richards looked surprised by her request but nodded. Of course, ma'am. Johnson Williams, you're dismissed to your rooms pending further review. Major Harrison will arrange temporary gate coverage. As the guards walked away, clearly shaken, Sarah turned to the three senior officers. I want to be clear about something from the very beginning of my time here. What happened today is not mainly the fault of those two young men. It's a symptom of bigger system-wide problems we need to address together. Major Harrison looked confused. Ma'am, with respect, they stopped you from entering the base and showed complete disregard for proper military rules. They did, Sarah agreed. But they did it because nobody properly trained them. Nobody communicated my arrival. Nobody maintained standards at this checkpoint, and nobody taught them how to think critically about security versus procedure. This is a leadership failure, not just an individual failure. Sergeant Major Thompson nodded slowly, beginning to understand Sarah's perspective. You're saying we need to look at why they felt empowered to act that way in the first place. Exactly, Sarah said. Private Johnson felt confident enough to overrule his sergeant and ignore direct communication from the base commander's office. That tells me he's never been taught proper respect for authority. Sergeant Williams allowed security procedures to become so relaxed that this checkpoint looks like a college dorm instead of a military facility. Colonel Richards studied Sarah carefully, clearly trying to understand her leadership approach. What are you suggesting we do about it? I'm suggesting we use this as a learning opportunity instead of a punishment opportunity, Sarah said. Those two soldiers will remember this day for the rest of their careers. We can make sure they remember it as the day they learned how to be better soldiers. Or we can make sure they remember it as the day their careers were destroyed for making mistakes their leadership allowed to happen. The three officers exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this approach from their new commanding officer. In their experience, incidents like this usually resulted in quick disciplinary action and transfers. Sarah's suggestion to look at system-wide causes rather than individual blame was a different way of thinking about military leadership. Ma'am, Major Harrison said carefully. Are you saying there should be no consequences for their actions? Not at all, Sarah replied. I'm saying the consequences should be educational and corrective, rather than purely punishing. Private Johnson needs to learn about authority and military behavior. Sergeant Williams needs to learn about maintaining standards and supervising others. Both need to understand their actions today could have had serious security implications. Sergeant Major Thompson was nodding with growing approval. A remedial training program instead of disciplinary action, combined with very clear expectations going forward, Sarah added, and a complete overhaul of gate security procedures, communication rules, and standards enforcement across the entire base. As they talked, Sarah was already starting to implement her leadership philosophy at Fort Henderson. She believed most problems in military units came from failures in training, communication, and leadership, rather than from individual character flaws. Her approach was to identify root causes and address them systematically, rather than just punishing symptoms. The drive through Fort Henderson revealed the full scope of challenges Sarah would face. As their convoy moved past various buildings and training areas, she saw signs of an organization that had lost its focus. Soldiers walked with hands in pockets, uniforms that didn't meet basic standards, and a general casualness that spoke to poor leadership and low morale. Colonel Richards seemed to read her thoughts as he pointed out various facilities. As you can see, ma'am, we have significant challenges across multiple areas. The previous commander left us with some serious problems we're still working to address. Sarah nodded, taking mental notes as they passed the store, where she noticed trash scattered around the entrance nobody had cleaned. Near the vehicle area, several trucks sat with obvious maintenance problems that appeared ignored for weeks. The base housing showed signs of neglect, with lawns needing cutting and minor repairs that had been put off. Major Harrison, Sarah said, how long has it been since we had a comprehensive inspection of base operations? About 8 months, ma'am, Harrison replied uncomfortably. The last inspection resulted in several areas being marked unsatisfactory, but we haven't had the resources or leadership continuity to address all the identified problems. Sergeant Major Thompson added, we've been operating in crisis mode for the better part of a year. Every time we start making progress in one area, something else breaks down and demands immediate attention. Sarah understood this pattern well. It was common in organizations where leadership had been unstable or ineffective. Without clear priorities and consistent standards, units often found themselves constantly fighting fires rather than preventing them. The solution required both immediate action and long-term systematic change. As they pulled up to the headquarters building, Sarah saw that even this central facility showed signs of the base's problems. The flagpole needed attention, the building exterior needed maintenance, and the parking area was poorly organized. These were small details, but they reflected the overall state of military discipline and pride. Gentlemen, Sarah said as they prepared to exit the vehicle, I want to schedule a comprehensive base tour over the next week. I need to see every facility, meet with every department head, and get a clear picture of our current state. But first, I want to address the immediate problems we observed today. Inside the headquarters building, Sarah was escorted to what would be her office. The space was functional but showed the same signs of neglect she'd seen throughout the base. The previous commander apparently hadn't put much effort into maintaining even basic professional standards in his own workspace. Major Harrison, I want you to arrange a meeting with all department heads for tomorrow morning at 8. I also want to meet with senior enlisted leadership this afternoon, and please have someone prepare a comprehensive briefing on our current personnel problems, training status, and operational readiness. Yes, ma'am, Harrison replied, clearly relieved to have specific direction after months of uncertainty. Sergeant Major Thompson, I want you to personally oversee the remedial training program for our gate guards. Design something that addresses not just their specific mistakes but helps them understand their role in overall base security and military professionalism. Understood, ma'am. I'll have a program outline ready for your review by end of business today. Sarah walked to her office window and looked out at the base now under her command. Fort Henderson had approximately 5,000 people, making it a significant responsibility and a substantial opportunity to make a positive impact. The problems she'd observed were serious but also fixable with proper leadership and sustained effort. Colonel Richards, she said, turning back to face the acting base commander who would soon transfer to a new assignment. I want you to know, I don't see the current situation as a reflection of personal failure on your part. You were put in an impossible position after the previous commander's departure, and you've done your best to maintain stability. Richards looked relieved by her assessment. Thank you. It's been a challenging period, and I'm grateful you're here to provide the leadership continuity we need. However, Sarah continued, I need you to help me understand how things got this bad. I need an honest assessment of the system-wide problems, not just the obvious symptoms. What happened to our standards? Why did discipline break down? How did we lose the pride and professionalism that should define a military base? The three officers exchanged glances, clearly understanding Sarah was asking for a level of honesty that might be uncomfortable. She wasn't interested in polite explanations or bureaucratic excuses. She wanted the truth about how Fort Henderson reached its current state. Colonel Richards took a deep breath before responding. Ma'am, it started with inconsistent leadership. The previous commander had a very hands-off approach, delegating most decisions without providing clear guidance or expectations. When problems arose, the response was often reactive rather than preventative. Over time, standards began slipping because nobody was consistently enforcing them. Major Harrison added, we also had several senior leaders transfer out during that period, which created gaps in day-to-day supervision and mentorship. The replacement people weren't properly oriented to base standards, so they often accepted whatever they found as normal. Sergeant Major Thompson nodded grimly. The real problem was we stopped holding people accountable. When someone failed to meet standards, there were always excuses or exceptions. Eventually, meeting standards became optional rather than required. Sarah listened carefully to their explanations, understanding she was hearing about the kind of leadership failures that could destroy unit effectiveness and military readiness. The challenge now was reversing these trends, without destroying morale or creating an atmosphere of fear and punishment. Over the following days, Sarah conducted her comprehensive review of Fort Henderson with careful precision. She visited every major facility, observed training exercises, ate meals in the enlisted dining hall, and spent time in the barracks talking with soldiers at all levels. What she discovered confirmed her initial assessment that problems ran deep but weren't insurmountable. The training facilities were underused because of equipment that hadn't been properly maintained. The medical clinic was functioning but operating with outdated procedures and insufficient coordination with other base services. The family housing area had maintenance backlogs affecting the quality of life for military families. Most concerning, she found many soldiers had lost confidence in their leadership and were simply going through the motions rather than taking pride in their service. During meetings with department heads, Sarah discovered communication between different units was practically non-existent. Each department operated independently without coordination or shared goals. This explained how situations like the gate incident could occur. There was no system to ensure important information was properly shared throughout the base. The fundamental problem, Sarah explained to her senior staff during their daily briefing, is we've been managing problems instead of leading people. Management is about maintaining the status quo, but leadership is about inspiring people to achieve excellence. She decided to implement what she called a foundation-first approach to rebuilding Fort Henderson. Instead of trying to fix everything at once, she'd focus on establishing basic standards and procedures that would create a framework for long-term improvement. We're going to start with 3 fundamental principles, she announced. First, clear communication. Every important decision, policy change, or operational update will be communicated through multiple channels to ensure everyone receives the information they need. Second, consistent standard. We'll establish clear expectations for everything from uniform appearance to facility maintenance, and will enforce those standards fairly and consistently. Third, individual accountability combined with system-wide support. Major Harrison asked, "Ma'am, how do we implement these changes without creating resentment among people who've become used to the current environment?" It was a smart question that showed Harrison understood the human dynamics of organizational change. Sarah had been thinking about this challenge since arriving, knowing sudden changes could create resistance rather than improvement. We involve people in the solution, Sarah replied. Rather than imposing changes from above, we're going to ask our soldiers to help us identify problems and develop solutions. People support what they help create. She'd already begun implementing this approach with the gate security situation. Instead of simply punishing Private Johnson and Sergeant Williams, she assigned them to work with Sergeant Major Thompson to develop new gate security procedures. They were required to research best practices, interview other base people about security concerns, and present their recommendations to the command staff. The transformation was remarkable. Both soldiers threw themselves into the project with enthusiasm, clearly motivated by being trusted with real responsibility rather than simply being punished for their mistake. Their preliminary recommendations showed thoughtfulness and attention to detail that had been completely absent during their original interaction with Sarah. Sergeant Major Thompson, Sarah said, "Tell us about the progress with our gate security review." Thompson smiled as he delivered his report. "Ma'am, Johnson and Williams have exceeded all expectations. They've identified 17 specific areas where our security procedures could improve, researched how other bases handle similar challenges, and developed a comprehensive training program for all gate people. They've also volunteered to pilot the new procedures and serve as trainers for other guards." This was exactly the kind of transformation Sarah hoped to achieve. By treating the gate incident as a learning opportunity rather than just a disciplinary matter, she'd converted two problem soldiers into engaged contributors to base improvement. She applied similar approaches throughout the base. Instead of simply ordering the vehicle area to improve maintenance, she challenged them to develop a program that could serve as a model for other bases. Rather than mandating improvements to the dining facility, she asked food service staff to research soldier preferences and develop menu options that would improve both nutrition and satisfaction. The results were becoming visible throughout Fort Henderson. Soldiers walked with better posture, uniforms were improving, facilities were being maintained more carefully, and there was a growing sense of pride in the base's appearance and operations. However, Sarah knew the real test of her leadership approach was yet to come. Cultural change in military organizations required sustained effort over months and years, not just weeks. She needed to establish systems and procedures that would maintain high standards, even when she wasn't personally supervising every detail. "Our next challenge," she told her staff, "is to make these improvements permanent so they become part of the base culture rather than just temporary responses to new leadership. We need to create systems that will maintain excellence regardless of personnel changes or external pressure." This meant developing comprehensive training programs, establishing clear promotion and recognition criteria, creating communication systems that would prevent future breakdowns, and building a sense of shared responsibility for base operations among all people. Sarah also knew her success would ultimately be measured not just by improved appearances and procedures, but by concrete outcomes, improved readiness ratings, higher retention rates, better training scores, and enhanced mission capability. The foundation work she was doing now would determine whether Fort Henderson could achieve those long-term goals. 6 months after her unconventional arrival at Fort Henderson, Sarah stood at the same gate where her command had begun. The transformation was remarkable. The checkpoint was now spotless with professional-looking guards who snapped to attention and delivered crisp salutes. The same flagpole that had displayed a wrinkled flag now flew colors that were properly maintained and ceremoniously raised and lowered each day. Private Johnson, now promoted to specialist, was serving as the senior gate guard for the morning shift. His uniform was perfect, his bearing was professional, and his approach to security duties reflected the high standards that had become normal throughout the base. When he saw Sarah approaching, he immediately stood at attention and delivered a perfect salute. "Good morning, Colonel Martinez," he said with genuine respect and pride. "All security procedures are current, and we have no problems to report." Sarah returned his salute with satisfaction. "Thank you, Specialist Johnson. How are the new training procedures working out?" "Excellently, ma'am. We've had 3 other bases send representatives to observe our gate security program, and 2 of them have requested copies of our procedures manual. Sergeant Williams and I are scheduled to present our approach at the Regional Security Conference next month." This was exactly the kind of outcome Sarah hoped to achieve. Instead of being career-ending embarrassments, Johnson and Williams had become examples of how proper leadership and training could transform individual performance. Their success story had become part of the base culture, demonstrating that mistakes could be learning opportunities rather than permanent failures. As Sarah walked through the base, she saw evidence of transformation everywhere. The vehicle area was operating at peak efficiency with readiness rates that exceeded Army standards. The dining facility had received recognition for excellence in both food quality and customer service. The base housing area had become a model for other bases, with well-maintained facilities and active community programs. Most importantly, the soldiers at Fort Henderson were displaying the kind of pride and professionalism that made military service meaningful. Retention rates had improved dramatically, training scores were consistently above average, and the base had earned recognition for operational excellence in several areas. The morning briefing that day included reports from various department heads about their ongoing success story. The base had not only recovered from its previous problems, but had become a sought-after assignment for military people who wanted to be part of an excellent organization. "Ma'am," Major Harrison reported, "we've received official notification that Fort Henderson has been selected to host the annual Regional Leadership Conference. The Pentagon specifically cited our transformation over the past 6 months as an example of effective military leadership." Sarah nodded with satisfaction, but she also knew the real measure of success wasn't external recognition, but internal culture. The question was whether the changes they'd implemented would sustain themselves over time, through personnel rotations and changing circumstances. "Sergeant Major Thompson," she said, "give us an update on our leadership development programs." "Ma'am, we now have 43 people enrolled in advanced leadership training, including 15 who've been selected for promotion to senior positions at other bases. The program we developed here is being adopted by 6 other bases, and we've been asked to provide trainers to help implement it." This was perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Sarah's success at Fort Henderson. The leaders they were developing would carry the lessons learned here to other bases, multiplying the positive impact far beyond the boundaries of their own base. Sarah had also implemented systems to ensure future leadership transitions wouldn't result in the kind of decline that occurred before her arrival. These included comprehensive handover procedures, mentorship programs, and regular assessment protocols that would identify potential problems before they became serious issues. The base now had clear communication systems that ensured important information was properly shared, accountability measures that maintained standards without creating fear, and recognition programs that encouraged excellence while supporting professional development. As Sarah prepared for her own eventual transition to new responsibilities, she reflected on the lessons learned during her time at Fort Henderson. The most important insight was that organizational transformation required patience, consistency, and a genuine belief in people's potential for growth and improvement. The gate incident that marked her arrival had become a symbol of the broader transformation at Fort Henderson. It demonstrated that first impressions could be misleading, that apparent failures often revealed system-wide problems that could be addressed, and that leadership was fundamentally about developing people rather than simply managing operations. Standing in her office, looking out at a base that now demonstrated military excellence, Sarah felt proud of what they'd accomplished together. Fort Henderson had become proof that with proper leadership, clear standards, and genuine care for people, any organization could transform itself from mediocrity to excellence. The young guards who once prevented her from entering the base were now training others in professional standards and security procedures. The same principles that guided their individual transformation had been applied throughout the installation, creating a culture of continuous improvement and shared responsibility for excellence. Sarah's unconventional arrival had led to conventional success, measured not just in improved statistics and recognition, but in the personal and professional growth of thousands of military people who now understood that excellence wasn't just possible but expected. This was the true legacy of leadership, not just solving immediate problems, but creating systems and cultures that would continue to produce excellence long into the future.